In this lecture, we are going to answer the question, what is the GDPR? Additionally, we will discuss who must adhere to the GDPR, and we will discuss key terms you need to know about this law. So what is the GDPR? GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. This is a regulation on information privacy in the European Union and the European Economic Area, or EEA. The EU is made up of 27 member states, and the EEA is an extension of the EU single market to include Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. For me, this is a very testable point, the difference between the EU and the EEA. You may not see this as a multiple choice question, but the EU or EEA may come up in a question, and you'll need to read that question carefully and understand the context in order to select the correct response. For the CIPP US, we need to know that there are 3 categories of companies that must adhere to the GDPR. These include companies with assets and employees in the European Union, companies that sell to the European Union, and companies that store data in the European Union. There are several key terms that you need to know for the CIPP US. These include personal data and sensitive personal data, data subject, data controller and processor, consent, data protection authority or DPA, and data protection officer, DPO. Many of these terms we've already come across, and so this should mostly be a review. With regards to personal data and sensitive personal data, there is a distinction. In the GDPR, personal data is data that relates to, quote, an identified or identifiable person, unquote. Personal data in the EU is not always considered personal data in the US. And 2 examples we've already come across are IP address and cookies. These are both considered personal data in the European Union. Sensitive personal data is data with special characteristics. Data elements considered personal data are race and ethnic origin, political positions, religion, philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic, biometric, and health data, and sexuality. And in the GDPR, in order to collect sensitive personal data, a business must obtain, quote, explicit consent, unquote, to process for a specific purpose. In previous lectures, we've talked about the identifiability spectrum, and 3 points on that spectrum would be identified, pseudonymized, and anonymized. At the far end of the spectrum would be identified data. This is data that includes PII or personal data. Pseudonymized data might be located in the middle of the spectrum, and this is data that's been de-identified, but where re-identification is possible. And then the other end of the spectrum is anonymized data. This is where re-identification is impossible. A data subject is the individual whose data is collected. For example, if I'm collecting your data, then you are the data subject. Data controller. A data controller is an individual or organization that determines the reason and methods of processing. And under the GDPR, data controllers have many obligations. These include data protection by design and by default. Data controllers must identify an authority for collection. They must provide instruction, maintain records, provide appropriate data and cybersecurity. They must have breach reporting and notification plans in place. Data controllers must also designate a data protection officer or DPO. They must also collaborate with data protection authorities and conduct data protection impact assessments. or DPIA. In contrast to a data controller, a data processor is an individual or organization that processes data on behalf of the controller. It's important to understand that the controller contracts with the processor, and the controller is legally responsible. Data processors also have obligations. These include complying with controller instructions, confidentiality, maintaining records, providing the appropriate security and breach notification, and cooperating with data protection authorities. The concept of consent in the GDPR is different than it is in the US. In the GDPR, consent is more detailed. In the GDPR, consent must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. For consent to be informed, the business must divulge the data controller's identity, the purpose for processing the data that is going to be collected, provide the data subject with the right to withdraw. If any automated processing of the data is going to be taking place, the business must provide information on that. And the data controller must also inform the data subject on transfer risks. And unlike in the US, under the GDPR, the burden is on the business to demonstrate that the subject was informed and consented. What is a data protection authority? A DPA performs investigations and enforces the GDPR at the national level. So again, you'll remember that in the European Union, there are 27 member states. Each of those member states will have a data protection authority. The exception is Germany, where there is one federal DPA and 16 Länder or state-level DPAs. And in Germany, the federal DPA oversees the public sector, whereas the Länder DPAs oversee the commercial sector. Data protection authorities also provide guidance and interpretation, and they are independent public authorities. Again, this is just a hunch, but I think knowing Länder and the difference here between the member states and Germany is important. That seems to me something that's very testable. Now that we know about data protection authorities, we can talk about data protection officers. DPOs are EU-based business points of contact, which I've abbreviated here as POC for point of contact, for data protection issues. They review business compliance. DPOs have 2 required qualifications that we need to know for the CIPP US. These include relevant work experience in data protection and no conflicts of interest. You might remember from a previous lecture that we encountered the term separation or segregation of duties. This is similar to a 2-person control. We want there to be 2 people we can trust in order to carry out a particular duty or responsibility. In this case, we want no conflicts of interest. So we don't want someone who's processing the data to also be responsible for monitoring the processing of the data. Companies are required to have a DPO when data subjects reside in the EU, when data is stored or originated in the EU, when there is large-scale monitoring of data subjects, and when there's large-scale processing of sensitive personal data. And for businesses that do not have a physical location in the European Union, these businesses require an EU representative. In this lecture, we have answered the question, what is the GDPR? The GDPR is a regulation on information privacy in the European Union and the European Economic Area. Companies with assets and employees in the EU, companies that sell to the EU, and companies that store data in the EU must all adhere to the GDPR. Key terms that you need to know for the CIPP US are personal data and sensitive personal data, data subject, data controller and processor, consent, data protection authority or DPA, and data protection officer or DPO.